Usually, when you think about a fortress, there is a pretty clear expectation of physical security. You picture those thick stone walls, a massive iron gate, maybe a moat.
Right, the classic medieval setup.
Yeah, precisely. The enemy is on the outside, you are on the inside, and well, as long as those walls hold up against the battering rams, you are completely safe.
Because the threat is external, it is visible, the battle lines are, they're clearly drawn on a map, and it is entirely binary. You are either inside the fortress, secure from the arrows, or you are outside of it, just totally exposed to the enemy.
But then you step into the world of the human mind, you step into the reality of spiritual warfare, and suddenly that thick stone wall is completely useless. You are looking at a battleground where the enemy is, well, they're already inside the gates.
Yeah.
The threat is sitting right there in the throne room of your own thoughts, dictating terms.
It is the absolute definition of an inside job. It's a betrayal from within our very own nature. The siege is not happening on the perimeter walls, it is happening in the intellect, the imagination, and the affections.
Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today we are taking a deep dive into the source material found in Charles Spurgeon's massive, multi-volume work, The Treasury of David. Specifically, we're going to look at his exposition of Psalm 119, verses 113 through 120, which is historically known as the Samic octave.
And the texts we've compiled for this include Spurgeon's own insights, but they also bring in brilliant historical commentary from 17th century Puritan thinkers and theologians, men like Thomas Manton, William Cowper, and Thomas Chalmers.
The mission for this deep dive is to thoroughly examine the believer's internal battle against sin. We're going to look at the absolute reliance on God's sustaining grace to survive that battle, and finally, the holy awe produced by God's righteous judgments.
But before we jump into the first verse, we really need to establish the theological framework we're operating from here.
Right, the baseline.
Yeah. As the name of the show suggests, our discussion today relies on Reformed theology. The writers we are studying and our own perspectives as hosts align with the Westminster Confession of Faith.
So for you listening, that means we are operating from a baseline that acknowledges total depravity, the perseverance of the saints, and the absolute sovereignty of God in both his justice and his mercy.
We believe that mankind has fallen, that our minds are tainted by sin, and that salvation is entirely a work of divine grace from beginning to end.
And that framework is just, well, it's absolutely essential to making sense of these verses, right?
Oh, absolutely. When you understand total depravity, you realize that sin is not just a series of bad habits. It is not just making external mistakes because you lacked information.
Like math error.
Right, exactly. I mean, spot on. It's not a math error. Total depravity means that corruption is an infection running through every single faculty of the human being. Your intellect has fallen. Your imagination has fallen.
So when you read the specific section of Psalm 119, you are reading the words of a man who understands his own inherent corruption and his desperate minute-by-minute need for divine intervention.
Yes.
Now, the previous section of Psalm 119 was highly practical. It focused heavily on the feet, walking in the right path, avoiding the wrong steps, taking physical action. But right here at verse 113, the writer pivots directly away from the feet and focuses on the heart and the mind. It becomes intensely internal.
It really does.
So why is inward emotion and thought treated as being just as crucial as outward physical acts in the Reformed tradition?
Well, because outward acts are simply the fruit of what is growing in the soil of the heart. The Puritans, they were brilliant psychologists of the human condition. They understood that if you only police your external behavior, you are just painting over rotten wood.
The structural integrity of the house is still completely compromised?
Precisely. In our theological tradition, the law of God does not just govern where your feet walk, it governs what your mind entertains. Jesus made this incredibly clear in the Sermon on the Mount when he equated unjust anger with murder and lustful thoughts with adultery.
The internal life is the fountainhead.
Yeah. If the spring is polluted, every stream flowing from it will be toxic. The psalmist recognizes that his greatest danger is not the army camped outside his door. It is the thought taking root inside his head.
That sets us up perfectly for verse 113. It begins with a jarring statement. I hate vain thoughts, but thy law do I love. Spurgeon points out that the writer is contrasting the fixed verity, the absolute truth of God's law, with the constantly changing vanity of man's opinions.
And Spurgeon offers a really sharp critique of what he calls modern thought. He argues that taking pride in our own intellectual musings is just the old pride of the human heart showing its face in a new century.
Which is pretty convicting, honestly.
It is. Spurgeon identifies the sheer arrogance in human reasoning. We like to think that our modern intellectual progress elevates us, but Spurgeon argues that when a human being thinks his highest, most polished thoughts, those thoughts are still as far below divine revelation as the earth is beneath the heavens.
The law of God is a fixed rock. The opinions of men are shifting sand. So hating vain thoughts means recognizing that your own unguided intellect is a flawed, broken compass.
Right. And to really grasp what makes a thought vain, we have to look at the historical commentary here. Theodore Hock, a 17th century scholar, describes these vain thoughts as double-hearted imaginations.
Double-hearted.
Yeah. He uses the imagery of branches shooting up confusedly in a tree. Imagine a tree where the branches are just a chaotic, tangled mess, blocking out the sunlight and choking each other out. That is what a divided, double-minded heart looks like. It lacks pruning.
It is a state of perpetual inner chaos. You are trying to pursue God, but your mind is constantly shooting off these wild branches of worldly desire, anxiety, or pride.
Thomas Watson, another prominent Puritan, captures this beautifully when he talks about our minds wandering during prayer. He compares the human heart to quicksilver or mercury.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
It is. If you press your finger on a drop of mercury, it instantly scatters into a dozen smaller drops. It will not fix in one place. Watson calls these roaming thoughts wandering stars.
And Watson also quotes Jerome, the early church father, who complained bitterly about his own wandering mind. Jerome said that sometimes, right in the middle of worship, his mind would just go walking in the galleries, or he would start casting up accounts.
Basically doing his taxes in his head while trying to pray.
Yeah, which is incredibly relatable for anyone listening right now who struggles to focus during a Sunday service. I know I do.
Oh, absolutely. Christopher Wordsworth adds another layer to this, connecting vain thoughts to skeptical doubts. He defines it as halting between two opinions, constantly second-guessing God's promises.
But we cannot treat these wandering thoughts as harmless quirks of our psychology, right?
No, we really can't. Thomas Manton provides a highly specific, granular breakdown of the vain thoughts that engross the mind. He categorizes them into 6 distinct sins of thought.
6 of them, okay.
Yeah, it's a staggering diagnostic list. The first one he identifies is uncleanness. He defines this as speculative wickedness that paves the way for active sin.
Speculative wickedness. That is a very polite 17th century way of describing the mental rehearsal of sin.
It really is.
The physical act always begins in the theater of the mind. You play out the scenario, you imagine the conversation, you visualize the action long before your body ever moves to commit the deed. You are testing the waters of rebellion in an environment where you think no one can see you.
That's spot on. The second category Manton gives is revenge. He compares holding a grudge to keeping liquor until it sours. You dwell on your discontents until they turn to vinegar in your soul.
Wow.
And the terrifying thing about revenge, as Manton notes, is that purposes of retaliation are actually sweet and pleasant to our carnal nature. We enjoy nursing our grievances.
We build mental courtrooms where we sit as the judge, we call the witnesses, and the person who wronged us is always found guilty. We execute them in our minds 100 times over.
Yes, that's it perfectly. Manton's third category is envy. He calls it an evil disease that feeds on the mind. He uses the historical example of King Saul from the Old Testament.
Oh, right. David and Goliath.
Yeah. When Saul heard the women singing that David had slain his 10,000s while Saul had only slain his thousands, that single thought lodged in Saul's mind. It ate away at him in secret, breeding a hatred that consumed his entire reign and eventually his sanity.
Envy happens completely in the dark. It is a parasite that drains your joy over what God has given you because you are fixated on what God gave someone else.
The fourth sin of thought is pride. This is where we entertain our hearts with whispers of vanity and self-conceit.
Like playing the hero in your own daydream.
Exactly. I mean, yes, absolutely. It's imagining the applause of other people. It is crafting hypothetical scenarios where your intellect or your generosity is publicly recognized.
That one hits close to home.
It does for all of us. Then fifth, Manton lists covetousness. These are vain musings that withdraw the heart even during God's worship. Manton references the prophet Ezekiel, who criticized the people for sitting before God and listening to his words while their hearts went after their covetousness.
So you are physically in a pew, but your mind is checking your investment portfolio or planning a purchase.
Precisely. And the sixth category Manton lists is distrust. This one might be the most damaging of all because it is a direct assault on the character of God.
How does he define it?
He says distrust consists of distracting motions against God's providence. It is sitting around calculating all the ways God might fail you tomorrow.
Oh, man.
Yeah. It is mentally rehearsing worst-case scenarios and acting as if God is not on his throne. You are burning emotional energy trying to solve problems that have not even happened yet, operating under the assumption that you are completely alone.
So all 6 of these uncleanness, revenge, envy, pride, covetousness, and distrust are what the psalmist means by vain thoughts.
Yes. And Thomas Goodwin takes the definition of vanity even further. He says vanity is characterized by unprofitableness. Our natural thoughts will not stand us in any stead during times of temptation, distress, or on the day of judgment. They offer zero return on investment.
Zero.
Goodwin also calls them light. He says they float at the top of the mind like scum on a boiling pot of water. They are full of folly, inconstancy, popping like bubbles, and outright wickedness.
The imagery of scum and bubbles perfectly illustrates the lack of substance in our natural thinking. Scum rises to the top, but it has no nutritional value. A bubble takes up space. It might even catch the light and look colorful for a fraction of a second, but there's absolutely nothing solid inside it.
It's just air.
Right. When the pressure of reality hits, the bubble vanishes. Our vain thoughts operate the same way. They occupy massive amounts of our mental space, but they offer zero spiritual nourishment or defense when an actual crisis arrives.
Thomas Scott brings up a compelling point about what he calls our vacant hours. Think about the time you spend driving to work, doing the dishes, or standing in line at the grocery store.
The downtime.
Yeah. Scott says these unprofitable imaginations naturally rush in to fill the void during those hours of solitude. It is a matter of mental physics. Nature abhors a vacuum. If your mind is empty, the weeds will automatically start growing.
That brings up a massive practical question for you, the listener. How do you police your own daydreaming? I think of the mind like a garden. You cannot just passively sit there and hope the weeds go away on their own. If you leave a patch of dirt alone, weeds will automatically take over. You do not have to plant them.
Stephen Charnock offers a brilliant mechanical solution to this. He says you must ballast the heart with love to God. You have to deliberately crowd out the weeds by planting something heavier and more substantial.
That concept of ballast is the key. If a massive cargo ship is sailing across the ocean with an empty hull, it will be tossed wildly by every small wave and gust of wind. It sits too high in the water.
It needs weight.
Right, the ship needs heavy cargo, or actual water pumped into its ballast tanks, to give it the necessary weight to cut through the waves smoothly. Charnock argues that a deep theological affection for God acts as that heavy weight in the hull of your soul, keeping you steady.
When you deliberately fill your mind with the truth of God's law, you are adding ballast. The vain thoughts will still try to intrude, but when your mind is heavily weighted with love for God, those frivolous thoughts are quickly identified as foreign invaders and turned out of doors.
But even with that ballast, the believer eventually realizes the sheer volume of these vain thoughts attacking the mind all day long. They recognize a terrifying truth. They cannot win this battle by their own strength.
No, they can't.
The mind is a leaky ship, and the water is constantly rushing in faster than you can bail it out. This realization drives us to the absolute need for divine shelter, which brings us to verse 114. The psalmist cries out, "Thou art my hiding place and my shield, I hope in thy word."
Notice the mechanism here. David does not run to a theological concept to escape his own mind. He flees directly to the person of God himself.
Yes, when David is overwhelmed by the spiritual assault of his own internal corruption, he casts himself upon the real presence of a triune God. And the protection he finds there has a dual nature, which the commentators highlight as both secrecy and active defense.
The hiding place provides the secrecy, and the shield provides the active defense. George Horne gives us a vivid picture of the hiding place. He compares it to a hen hiding her offspring under her wings when she sees a bird of prey hovering in the sky.
The little chicks do not run out and try to fight the hawk.
Right, they lack the talons and the strength for that battle. Their only survival strategy is to completely disappear under the shadow of their mother.
While the hiding place provides concealment, the shield provides impenetrable defense. Thomas Manton breaks down the physics of a truly excellent shield. He says it must have 3 properties to be effective.
First, its largeness. It must be broad enough to hide the entire person from the darts flung at them.
Makes sense.
Second, its hardness. It must be completely impenetrable, answering to the invincible power of God's providence. A wooden shield might stop an arrow, but it will shatter under a heavy blow. God's shield never fractures.
And the third property?
Third, a hard shield actually beats the darts back upon the enemy who threw them. God does not just absorb the attack, he reflects the kinetic energy of the evil back upon the forces of darkness.
Wow. Ralph Robinson, an expert Puritan writer, filters this entire verse through a strictly Christological lens. He looks at Jesus Christ and provides 5 specific qualifications that make Christ the ultimate hiding place. Let's walk through Robinson's list because the way he applies this to the believer's security is staggering.
Number 1 is strength. Christ is the rock of ages. Robinson points out that paper houses will never make good hiding places.
If your theology is made of paper, if your view of Jesus is just a mild moral teacher, the devil will punch right through it. You need a fortress made of solid rock to withstand the artillery of hell.
Absolutely. Number 2 is height. A hiding place must be extremely high. Low houses are easily scaled by an invading army using siege ladders.
So Christ is elevated.
Yeah, Robinson notes that Christ is the Jacob's ladder that reaches from earth to heaven. He is elevated far beyond the reach of human schemes or demonic assaults. No creature can scale those high walls. When you are hidden in Christ, you are lifted out of the horizontal battlefield entirely.
Number 3 is secret places. The more secret a place is, the safer it is. Robinson notes that Christ has hidden chambers that no creature can ever find.
He references the Song of Solomon, speaking of the dove in the secret places of the stairs.
Right. The secular world cannot understand the comfort and peace a believer possesses, because that peace is hidden inside the secret, unmapped chambers of Christ's presence. It is classified territory.
The 4th qualification is faithfulness, which is critical for actual security. A false-hearted protector is actually worse than an open pursuer.
Oh, for sure. If you hide in a massive fortress, but the commander of that fortress can be bribed by your enemy to open the gates in the middle of the night, you are doomed.
But Christ is the faithful witness. He cannot be bribed to surrender a single creature who comes to hide in him. He would die, and indeed, he did die before he would betray the trust of one of his sheep.
And the 5th qualification is diligence. A sleepy guard can betray a garrison just as easily as a faithless one.
If the watchman falls asleep at his post, the enemy walks right in without firing a shot.
But Christ never slumbers. Robinson says Christ has intelligencers, his own eyes, running to and fro throughout the whole earth. He sees every contrivance, every trap being set for his people long before the trap is even sprung.
When you combine that strength, height, secrecy, faithfulness, and diligence, you realize that hoping in God's word is not some vague, optimistic wishing. It is an ironclad guarantee based on the nature of the protector. The second half of verse 114 says, I hope in thy word. This hope is generated entirely by the character of the God who built the hiding place.
William Grant has a beautiful quote about the mechanics of this hope. He calls hope the firstborn, the last buried child of foreseeing man. He points out that without hope, reflecting men and women cannot be truly happy.
You might have past joys to remember or present joys to experience right now, but if the future looks dark and threatening, those present joys taste bitter.
But how does this hope actually act as a quietus, a silencer for our fret and worry?
It silences worry because it shifts the burden of your security entirely off your own shoulders and onto the shoulders of a sovereign God. Think about your own anxieties. When you are fretful, you are usually trying to mentally manage circumstances over which you have absolutely no physical control.
Hope in God's word acts as a silencer because it is a definitive declaration that the outcome is already secured by a God who cannot lie. You do not have to figure out how to defeat the enemy. You only have to run into the hiding place and let the Rock of Ages absorb the impact.
Once you are safe inside that secret hiding place, you begin to realize that maintaining this massive peace requires strictly monitoring who is allowed inside the gates with you. You do not invite the enemy into the bunker.
And that is exactly what David does next in verse 115, establishing the outer boundary. The psalmist declares, "Depart from me, ye evildoers, for I will keep the commandments of my God."
Spurgeon observes that David is actively purging his palace of parasites.
Parasites.
Yeah, David is a king, and kings are constantly surrounded by flatterers who will break God's laws in secret while pretending to be loyal subjects in public. David knows he must sweep them out of his house to maintain his own integrity. In doing so, Spurgeon says David is anticipating Christ's final judgment. Depart from me, ye workers of iniquity.
The necessity of holy separation is a major theme for these writers. They understood the raw psychology of peer influence. George Swinnock uses brilliant agricultural metaphors to explain the mechanism of this influence.
He compares evil company to weeds choking out good corn. If you plant the best, most expensive seed in the world, but you surround it with noxious weeds, the good corn will never thrive. The weeds will steal all the nutrients, the water, and the sunlight from the soil.
Swinnock also references a local historical legend about the mountain Kadesh, claiming that any vine planted near it would wither and die because the soil itself was fundamentally toxic.
Swinnock's point is that you cannot marry yourself to God's commands while maintaining a romance with wicked companions. The two are mutually exclusive.
William Cowper points out a beautiful, subtle detail in this verse. He notes the unique use of the pronoun my in the phrase my God. Out of this entire massive psalm of 176 verses, this is the only time the exact phrase my God occurs.
It shows the intensely personal, covenantal relationship the believer has with the Lord. Because God is his God, he cannot tolerate the presence of those who openly hate his king.
The danger of bad company was recognized even by pagan philosophers, which proves it is a universal law of human nature. John Edwards provides some fascinating historical anecdotes to illustrate this. He notes that the Roman poet Horace believed that sailing on a yacht with a profane person would literally cause the boat to sink.
The pagans believe that associating with someone who angered the gods would bring a physical curse down on everyone nearby. They understood collateral damage.
Edwards also mentions the Greek myth of Theseus and Perithous, two intimate friends who loved each other so much that they went down to hell together. They perished simply for company's sake.
And then Edwards gives a true Christian example from early church history. The story of the Apostle John fleeing a public bathhouse because he saw the heretic Cerinthus inside.
John ran out immediately, refusing to be under the same roof as a man who denied the divinity of Christ, fearing the structural roof might collapse on them both in judgment. But I am struggling with this strict separation idea. Let me push back here. If Swinnock says any vine planted near Kadesh dies, how does a modern believer actually function in the workplace or the neighborhood?
That's a very fair question.
How do you reconcile this severe command, "Depart from me, evildoers," with the clear Christian call to evangelize the lost? Jesus famously ate with tax collectors and sinners. Are we supposed to form a holy bunker, lock the door, and never speak to anyone who doesn't adhere to the Westminster Confession, because that seems to directly contradict the Great Commission?
That is the crucial tension of the Christian life, and the resolution lies in understanding the nature of the relationship and the direction of the influence. Evangelism is a rescue mission. It is running into a burning building to pull someone out.
Okay.
What the psalmist is talking about here is your inner circle. He's talking about the people who shape your core decisions, your affections, and your daily habits. As the Puritan writers clarify, you do not eat bread with traitors when you are trying to organize the defense of the king's castle.
Jesus ate with sinners as a physician healing the sick, not as a companion participating in their sickness.
That's right. He maintained complete moral authority in those interactions. The command to say, "Depart from me," is about preserving the sanctuary of your own heart. It means you do not allow people who are actively hostile to God's law to become your primary counselors, your deepest confidants, or your closest companions. If you do, their hostility will inevitably cool your own love for the law.
That distinction makes perfect sense. It is about who has a seat at the advisory table of your life. But here is the terrifying reality. Even when you are entirely alone, having successfully kicked out all the evildoers and bad influences, your greatest threat remains your own frail nature.
Even in total isolation, you will fall without God's constant active grip.
This takes us to the plea for sustaining grace, found in verses 116 and 117.
The verses read, "Uphold me according unto thy word, that I may live. Hold thou me up, and I shall be safe." Notice the desperate pleading tone.
The safety the psalmist is talking about is not based on a deposit of grace he received 10 years ago at his conversion. It is entirely dependent on present, continuous, active grace being supplied in the current moment.
The writers of the Westminster Confession hammered this point home when detailing the perseverance of the saints. The believer has zero inherent ability to stand upright on their own.
William Cowper states that our spiritual life stands only as long as the soul is being actively quickened by the Holy Spirit. If the Spirit withdraws his upholding hand, we collapse immediately.
Richard Greenham goes further, noting that spiritual life is measured exclusively by the death of sin. If you only look at your physical ability to eat, drink, walk around, or reason, Greenham says you are no different from the brute beasts or the heathen. True life is defined by God holding you up in holiness.
To visualize the mechanics of this total dependency, we have to look at the brilliant analogy provided by H.G. Salter. He compares the Christian soul to a kite soaring high in the sky.
I love this analogy.
It's so vivid. If you look at a kite way up in the air, you have to realize it is in a preternatural state. It is existing in an environment completely foreign to its own nature. Wood, string, and paper do not naturally belong in the sky. They belong on the ground.
Salter points out that the kite has absolutely no internal engine. It has no ability to generate lift or fly on its own. It is completely kept aloft by three external factors working in harmony: the wind blowing against it, the string tying it to the ground, and the hand firmly holding that string.
If the hand lets go or the wind stops, the kite does not just float gently in the clouds. The relentless, unforgiving law of gravity violently pulls it back down to the dirt.
Salter says the soul of the believer is identical to that kite. We have the exact same gravitational pull toward the earth, toward sin, that we ever had. We are raised to a heavenly state and kept there solely by the invisible, almighty hand of God. If he were to let go for one fraction of a second, we would plunge back into total ruin.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the Reformed doctrine of preservation. We persevere only because we are preserved. The tension on the string is our only lifeline.
And how does God actively hold his people up? How does he maintain his grip on that string? James Vaughan provides a fascinating list of the methods God uses to maintain our spiritual altitude.
Let's unpack those.
The first is through the preacher's word. A message spoken on a Sunday morning that hits your conscience right when you were about to make a disastrous decision.
The timing is just perfect.
Yeah. The second is through the sacraments, the tangible ordinances of baptism and communion that physically feed our faith.
Vaughan also mentions that God upholds us through a specific scripture, striking the mind when we are sitting alone in a room. Have you ever experienced that? You are entirely alone, spiraling into anxiety, and suddenly a promise you memorized years ago surfaces in your brain and stabilizes your heart.
It's incredible when that happens. Vaughan even mentions the ministration of angels, holding us up unseen so we do not dash our foot against a stone. But then Vaughan lists methods that are much harder for our modern sensibilities to swallow.
What does he say?
He says God sometimes upholds us through severe discipline and heavy affliction. Vaughan describes affliction as the grasp of God's hand tightening around us. It feels painful. It feels like we're being crushed, but we're actually being secured against a storm that would have blown us away.
The most counterintuitive method Vaughan mentions is when God appears to let you go. He uses the example of the Syrophoenician woman in the Gospels, whom Jesus initially seemed to ignore and even reject.
Vaughan says God sometimes acts as if he is forsaking you precisely to make you hold on to him tighter. By stepping back, he creates a hunger and a desperation in your soul that drives you deeper into his chest. All of these, the sermons, the scriptures, the suffering, and the apparent silence, are God's active methods of answering the prayer, "Hold on me up."
The psalmist adds a crucial phrase in verse 116, "And let me not be ashamed of my hope." Think about the implications of that. If our hope rested on our own strength, our own track record, or our own ability to fight off those vain thoughts we discussed earlier, we would be thoroughly humiliated in the end.
Our failure would be public, undeniable, and shameful.
But because our hope is anchored entirely in the God who holds the string of the kite, our hope will never be put to shame.
Understanding how desperately we need this upholding grace changes how we view those who actively reject it. When you realize that you only stand upright because of sheer, unmerited mercy, witnessing the fate of those who refuse that mercy becomes a terrifying thing. You are watching people cut their own string.
This brings us to the solemnity of divine justice in verse 118, which says, "Thou hast trodden down all them that err from thy statutes, for their deceit is falsehood."
Thou hast trodden down. That is a violent, highly active image.
God is not just passively letting the wicked wander off into the woods, he is actively setting his foot upon them. Spurgeon notes that men love to call their sinful strategies far-seeing policy or clever diplomacy. They think they have outsmarted the moral universe.
But God calls it falsehood, and he crushes it into the dust. He exposes their intellectual mask as a complete sham.
The modern world has a massive, almost allergic discomfort with the wrath of God. We love to talk about his mercy, his patience, and his love, but we violently recoil at the concept of his justice.
Thomas Chalmers addresses this discomfort brilliantly by framing it around the logical concept of moral government. Chalmers argues that a government without enforced laws is not a government at all. It is just a suggestion box.
Every law must have sanctions, clear promises of reward, and absolute threats of vengeance for violations.
Chalmers says if a judge only issues proclamations but never punishes violations, jurisprudence becomes a total mockery. If God only offered parental affection but never exacted justice on high-handed rebellion, the entire moral universe would drift into chaos. The sovereign would lose his throne.
God's wrath is not a divine temper tantrum. It is not an emotional outburst. It is the necessary mathematical enforcement of the moral order of the cosmos. Without it, right and wrong cease to exist.
And this enforcement is absolute. Thomas Manton unpacks the phrase treading down, explaining that it implies a punishment that is both fully comprehensive and deeply disgraceful. God does not just defeat his enemies in a gentlemanly duel, he brings them down to the dirt.
Mandan shares striking historical examples of this kind of total subjection to illustrate the metaphor. He mentions the Persian king Sapors, who captured the Roman emperor Valentinian and physically trampled upon his neck to show total dominance.
He also brings up the brutal conqueror Tamerlane, who captured the Sultan Bezeswith, put him in an iron cage, and literally used the Sultan's back as a footstool to mount his horse. God will reduce the proudest intellectual rebels to an abject, contemptible condition.
What do we make of the phrase at the end of the verse, their deceit is falsehood? Samuel Horsley and William Cowper suggest that this primarily means the wicked deceive themselves.
They're not just tricking other people or pulling one over on the church. They are falling for their own con.
Cowper says they flatter themselves with the vain conceit that they will somehow escape judgment. They look for a good in sin that sin promises, but fundamentally lacks the capacity to deliver. They swallow the poison, absolutely convinced it is wine, and they die deceiving themselves.
This self-deceit makes the ultimate judgment inevitable. The treading down is a necessary precursor to a broader, permanent cleansing of God's domain. And this leads us to the metaphor of the refining fire in verse 119, which states, "Thou puttest away all the wicked of the earth like dross, therefore I love thy testimonies."
Spurgeon comments that God does not handle the wicked with kid gloves. He judges them to be the scum of the earth, and he treats them accordingly. He removes them like dross so that they do not deteriorate the structural integrity of his church.
David Dixon connects this directly to Reformed ecclesiology, specifically the vital distinction between the visible church and the invisible church.
This is a crucial theological distinction that solves a lot of confusion for modern believers.
It really does. The visible church, the physical congregation that gathers in a building on a Sunday morning, contains both gold and dross. It contains true believers and hidden hypocrites. But the invisible church, the true body of Christ as God sees it from eternity, consists only of the elect.
Dixon points out that God is the ultimate refiner operating the furnace, and he will not fail to make a perfect separation. The extreme heat of his judgment will burn away the dross, leaving only the pure gold.
William Greenhill provides a brilliant breakdown of 6 specific characteristics of dross that show exactly why the refiner must remove it. He uses the science of metallurgy to explain spiritual realities.
Let's go through those 6 traits.
First, dross obscures the glory of the true metal. It coats the gold so you cannot see its shine.
Second, it is deceiving. It looks like the real metal to the untrained eye, but it isn't. Hypocrites in the church look like believers. They learn the vocabulary, they mimic the posture, but they lack the internal reality.
Third, dross is not bettered by the fire. This is a key chemical distinction. If you put gold in the fire, the heat burns away the impurities, and the gold emerges purer and more valuable.
If you put dross in the fire, it just burns up or remains a worthless lump. It does not possess the capacity to improve under pressure.
Fourth, it is inherently worthless, base, and vile.
Fifth, it is utterly useless. It lacks the molecular integrity to hold a sharp edge or bear a heavy load. If you make a sword out of dross, it shatters on the first swing. A hypocrite in the church looks fine when times are peaceful, but when persecution hits, they fracture.
The 6th characteristic is perhaps the most dangerous. It is offensive. Greenhill compares it to rust that actively eats into the good metal. The dross does not just sit there harmlessly taking up space, it corrupts the gold around it.
That is why the refiner must kindle the fire and separate it. If he leaves the dross in the crucible, the whole batch is ruined. The hypocrisy spreads.
But Thomas Manton asks a very perceptive question about the text. Why are they called the wicked of the earth?
Why is that specific phrasing used?
Manton says it's because they flourish here. Their names, as Jeremiah says, are written in the earth. They favor worldly greatness, and their hearts are entirely rooted in the soil of this present age.
All their investments are in a kingdom that is actively burning down. They have their portion in this life alone.
Which is the exact opposite of the believer's posture. Duncan McGregor points out that the true believer is a stranger on the earth. The believer is just passing through a hotel trying to learn the language of a foreign home.
So here's a massive question for you to consider. How do God's severities, his terrifying acts of judgment and burning away the dross, actually excite the love of his people. The psalmist says, "Thou puttest away the wicked. Therefore, I love thy testimonies."
That seems backward to modern ears. We usually associate judgment with fear, not love.
It seems backward until you truly understand the nature of holiness and preservation. Believers love God's justice because they realize it is the only mechanism that purges the infection from the church and from the universe.
If you genuinely love a garden, you must hate the weeds that are trying to kill the flowers. If a surgeon genuinely loves a patient, he must be completely merciless toward the cancer.
The believer loves God's testimonies because those testimonies promise that evil will not have the final word. The violent removal of the dross guarantees the safety and the purity of the gold. It is a severe, necessary mercy.
Witnessing that severity, witnessing the terrifying separation of the dross from the gold in the furnace, leaves the believer in a state of deep physical awe.
The reality of God's unshielded holiness is shattering, and that brings us to the physical reaction in verse 120, which reads, "My flesh trembleth for fear of thee, and I am afraid of thy judgments."
J.J. Stewart Perron offers a fascinating linguistic note on the Hebrew word translated as trembleth. He says it strictly refers to the hair standing erect in terror, piloerection.
This is not a mild, respectful reverence. This is a visceral, physiological shuddering. It is the body's involuntary response to coming face to face with the sheer, uncontrollable power of God.
This raises a massive theological tension. How can a believer who is entirely justified, safely hidden in the secret places of Christ, and upheld by sovereign grace, experience this level of physical terror?
If you know you are safe, why are you shaking?
Edward Payson addresses how this visceral fear of God is fully compatible with an absolute love for God. He argues that trying to separate fear and hope actually insults the nature of God.
Payson explains the logic. He says that if you fear God without hoping in his mercy, you are accusing God of tyranny. You are treating him as a cruel despot who delights in torturing his subjects.
But on the flip side, if you hope in God's mercy without having any fear of his judgments, you are calling God a liar. You are looking at all his warnings, his threatenings, and the reality of hell, and you are saying, he doesn't really mean it. He's bluffing.
True. Biblical religion requires the heavy, potent mixture of both fear and hope.
William Cowper notes that while familiarity with men breeds contempt, familiarity with God breeds reverence. The closer you get to a human celebrity, the more you see their flaws and the less you respect them.
But the closer you get to God, the more you realize how vast the chasm is between his blinding purity and your own frailty.
We see this play out in the diary of the great missionary Henry Martyn. He wrote, "I flew trembling to Jesus Christ, as if the flames were taking hold of me. He knew he was completely safe in Christ, but he still felt the intense radiating heat of the judgment he was escaping."
Neal and Littledale provide a brilliant structural insight based on the Hebrew alphabet used in Psalm 119. This specific octave is based on the Hebrew letter Se-Mi-C-H, which literally translates to a prop or a pillar.
Throughout these verses, we have seen God acting as a pillar, holding up the frail, kite-like believer. But his judgment on the wicked is like Samson putting his hands on the pillars and pulling the entire roof down on the Philistine lords.
The exact same pillar that supports the roof for the believer will crush the ungodly into dust. Knowing that dual reality makes the hair on your arms stand up.
Think of it like standing at the absolute edge of the Grand Canyon. When you walk right up to the rim and look down into that massive gorge, the sheer scale of it is breathtakingly beautiful.
But that massive, sudden drop rightly makes your heart race and your stomach drop. You are standing behind a heavy metal railing. You trust the railing completely.
That railing is God's upholding grace. It is the finished, unbreakable work of Christ. You know the railing will not give way.
But you still look over the edge and you respect the fall. The breathtaking beauty and the stomach-dropping terror exist in the exact same moment. You lean on the prop, but you tremble at the canyon.
That is the perfect picture of filial fear. It is not the cowering fear of a slave waiting to be whipped by a master. It is the wide-eyed awe of a child realizing the staggering, uncontrollable strength of their father.
When you recognize that the God who gently holds your string like a kite is the exact same God who violently treads down human empires into the dust, casual religion becomes a complete impossibility.
Let's trace the massive progression we've unpacked through these 8 verses. It starts in the mind, with a declared war against the internal chaos of vain thoughts.
Because you, the believer, realize you cannot win that internal war alone. You are driven to find a hiding place and an impenetrable shield in the person of Christ.
Safely hidden, you ruthlessly expel any toxic influences that might cool your love for the law.
Realizing you are still prone to fall even in isolation, you beg for continuous, sustaining grace to hold you up.
And finally, standing secure behind that metal railing of grace, you look out and witness God justly handling the deceitful dross of the earth, leaving you in a state of wide-eyed, physical trembling at his holiness.
It is a complete theological system packed into 8 short verses. It moves systematically from total depravity to irresistible grace to the perseverance of the saints, and it culminates in the correct posture for worshiping a sovereign God.
It really is an amazing sequence.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as we close out this deep dive. If the most righteous individuals in history, prophets, apostles, and Puritans, men who knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that they were entirely secure in God's upholding grace, still experienced physical trembling and hair-raising terror at the sheer holiness of God, what does that say about our modern, highly casual approach to worship? When we stroll into the presence of God demanding to be entertained by a rock band at a light show, are we truly resting in His grace, or have we just lost our sense of spiritual gravity altogether?